Lynlee, good evening to you in Australia. I think it's a little bit later in the day. It's wonderful to have you on the show, and just looking forward to getting into our discussion about grounded theory in the next hour or so. And as you guys are coming online and joining us in the show, and I think we've just had an overwhelming response from people. So grounded theory continues to grow in popularity as a research method. Both you and I have a PhD using grounded theory, although I'd say you're much more of the expert than I am. So Lynlee, as everybody starts to introduce themselves, we're going to ask them to post some questions on the chat, and we're going to answer their questions. You and I are going to have a discussion. I mean, this is going to be two-way. I had my ups and downs with grounded theory. You had your ups and downs. But before we get into all of that, how are you today? Tell us about yourself. You've moved over to Australia in the last few years. How are things going?
Oh, it is indescribable, to be honest. The challenges of moving, no one can actually warn you what that lands up looking like. But thank you for inviting me to deliver this talk on grounded theory. The fact that so many people are interested in grounded theory is so re-energizing because it's a bit of a challenging methodology. I always worry that people shy away from it. So the fact that people are interested is such a good thing, and it's so good to catch up with you after you have gotten your doctorate. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynlee. And I honestly say, I was just reflecting, in preparation for our chat today. I don't know when it was, maybe 2014 or 2015, but I went to a workshop that you gave in the afternoon at WITS, and I think, and I'd been looking at grounded theory. And from then I was determined that I was going to go for it. And 5-6 years later now, I can say I've done my PhD using grounded theory. And every step of the way, I look back on the workshop notes that I took from your session and the sort of direction that you gave me and the insights has all been so useful. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I want to pass all that value, back to our student success community, which I run here on YouTube. And we have a members only Facebook community. And there's just, I feel, a little bit of a gap in terms of, universities obviously driving a publish or perish pipeline of degrees and research, etc. Yeah. But where I'm finding a huge demand is for this coaching and insights and platforms like this where people can ask questions and get access to content and experts, etc. So that's exactly what we're doing, today. I know it's like 9 o'clock at night with you in Australia. It's midday here. So these are always, learn in your lunchtime kind of webinars. We all should be able to take a break and have some lunch and get some learnings as well. So we've got quite a few people, Kennedy, Hazard, Penelope, Latoya, Zonke, Siabula, Louise, Muriel, Simonkise, Armand, Bongi, Khomotso, etc. So guys, please now in the chat, put specific questions and just tell us at what stage you're at, in your journey with grounded theory. And maybe, Lynlee, let's just maybe go through it sort of in a bit of a sequence. Let's take somebody that is thinking about grounded theory, and they maybe read a couple of papers, they may be needing to get a proposal done, they know they want to go the qualitative route, etc. And perhaps where I was back then, 5 years ago, coming to your workshop, wanting to learn a bit more grounded theory, but maybe a little bit skeptical. What advice would you have for people at that stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being skeptical about what method to choose before you get married to that method is a very healthy approach to have. There's nothing worse than going, right, I'm going to choose this method, and then you kind of get your teeth into it, and then a year later you go, oh, this isn't the right method, or even worse, I hate it, right? You want to be passionate about the method that you've chosen. So I really suggest that students window shop, confirm whether the selected method you actually are choosing is going to actually allow you to answer your research question. So I always tell my students, don't try and jam a square peg into a round hole. Make sure you're choosing a method that helps you actually fulfill a purpose. So just because you're comfortable with a certain method doesn't mean that's the best way to go about answering your research question. So, for example, more traditional narrative methods may give you like a really beautiful description of how people respond to particular events and how those events occurred. But a grounded theory is going to give you an understanding of how and why people have behaved in those particular situations when they reflect back on that experience. And so they're able to give you information and like really nuanced descriptions and rich descriptions about their own behavior and their own decision making when they reflect back on their experience. So I would really suggest, choose a method that makes sense to you and answers your research question. I'd also suggest that depending on what level of study you're at, if you're doing a literature review or you're reading into your topic and you're starting to see that there's a glaring gap in the literature, this might be a very clear indication to you that grounded theory is the method to choose. Because if you're doing a master's level or a PhD level study, part of the marking criterion is you have to produce novel knowledge. That is exactly what grounded theory does. It helps you create a new theory that explains something that's pretty like novel by way of phenomenon. And so I would suggest be bold, be brave to do something that is pretty terrifying, but ultimately going to be so worth it. Your future self is going to say such a big thank you. Grounded theory is just a wonderful method that enables you to develop a theory, to give an explanation about a particular population, their experience of a phenomenon, and how they have made sense of it. So I would say if you're considering it, give it a good go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lynlee. That's fantastic. And I'm just going to relay a little bit of my own perspective, on why I chose grounded theory and how I did a bit of window shopping. And then I'd like to get to Rahil's question there, which maybe goes into the next phase of, understanding what it is. But before we get there, maybe my perspective on it is that my window shopping was a little bit, the Stephen Covey mindset of think with the end result in mind. I knew I wanted to create a new theory. And when I found a particular grounded theory thesis that was in my field, not on the specific topic that I was looking at, I was so impressed with the way that it packaged that new theory. I was sold on using grounded theory because of the end result. Then I sort of had to reverse engineer back and say, okay, but how did that person get to that? Let me go and understand what this grounded theory is. And that's where I want to get to Rahil's question just now. So I knew that to produce a good theory, to make a contribution into the industry, my thesis, and this is a lot that we coach people about, is to really have a very high quality final report. And the structure that grounded theory gave me, within which, I could create a scaffolding for my theory, that really, I think, structured the entire final report or thesis or whatever people call it in their degrees, made it worthwhile for me to go back through the pain and understand what it was. So the attraction of it was very much more in the end product of it. And then when I got into the detail of what it took to get there and the difficulty other people had in their experiences, I kind of didn't worry about that because I was so focused on the end goal. I just had to get through that. And I did feel that I eventually produced something that I was very proud of because of my use of grounded theory. It wasn't as if I had to get through grounded theory and the difficulties that comes with it just because I was attracted to the method. I was attracted more to the outcome that it gave me and the inductive nature that you could use it to make a contribution, as you said, and develop a novel contribution. And just before we get into Rahil's question, what I really liked about it was it goes one step further beyond describing something, but rather to explaining it. And it goes into the depths of what is actually going on in there. And maybe just for everyone listening, Lynlee, your PhD was on a fascinating topic of medical male circumcision, which, in South Africa, in our context of AIDS and, the prevalence of a lot of sort of medical considerations, was just also one of the other theses that I picked up and sort of used to see the outcome that I would get from grounded theory. So Lynlee, maybe over to you just to then give our viewers this afternoon. And by the way, this is also recorded for our podcast. So, anybody listening in on the podcast today, welcome to you guys as well. But Rahil's put a question up on the screen there. What exactly is grounded theory? Like a super short summary. Is that possible, Lynlee?
My goodness. No, I think I need 5 hours to answer that question. I think more so than speaking to the process, what I think is quite helpful for students at this stage is to kind of go into why grounded theory was created. So in the 1960s, Glaser and Strauss were very disillusioned with quantitative methods because they felt at the time we were just simply confirming existing theory. And they felt that research that was being published at the time was only confirming that theory, and research that was proving theories to not be true was actually being rejected for publication. So we weren't critiquing existing theories. We were just only reproducing theories and research that showed that those theories were correct. And so they become so disillusioned with this, where the quantitative studies that prove theories to be false, the methodology of that study would be critiqued rather than the theory being critiqued. And so they developed grounded theory as an approach to birth new theory out of the data itself. And this completely revitalized sociology and then broader social sciences that was really suffering from theory stagnation. But this is where things get a little bit messy, Peter, and I think maybe you would comment on this well, is Glaser and Strauss, the more they worked together, although they were using the same words, they started to realize that fundamentally they had different paradigmatic assumptions around the way that they see the world. And so what they understood about knowledge and how reality can make sense of that knowledge. And so they'll end up having a methodological divorce. And this is where it gets tricky, where students go, now it seems as if all of these different branches of grounded theory exist. Which one do I go about choosing? So, and that's why it's difficult to answer what exactly is grounded theory and how to do it. All depends on which branch of grounded theory you land up going into. But I hope that answers the question of what grounded theory actually is. It's a method that you follow to produce a theory, but it's also the methodology of producing that new theory that's really grounded in the data itself.
Fantastic. And just by the way, guys, on the YouTube channel, I did release a video. It's about 20 minutes, and I literally just stood up at the whiteboard and I did exactly that, a bit of a summation on the whiteboard of grounded theory from my own perspective. And I'm fairly certain that I got some of the technical terms wrong, but the comments that I got on that video was that it was just a practical break it down for me, draw some pictures for me, link it back to, okay, so I'm taking interview transcripts, then I'm coding those line by line. I'm abstracting that into categories, and I'm creating relationships between those categories of data at a higher and higher level until I have a core category that dominates the relationships between the most critical categories. And from that, I use something like coding families, to create some sort of visual or other framework or relationship, between the other categories that then results in the theory that I'm producing. What I put up on screen there, and Lynlee, I sort of also try to understand between Strauss and Glaser, and I tried to get into their books, and then I think Kathy Shaw-Maz, she actually passed away this year. Interestingly, I mean, she was also then maybe the third or the fourth real pioneer of grounded theory. And I did honestly struggle to get into a lot of their writings, but Burks and Mills, so the book that I put up here, changed my perception of grounded theory because of the practical way in which it broke it down for me. And I mean, there's literally one table in there where it says, okay, so Strauss calls it this, Glaser calls it this, Shaw-Maz calls it this. It is actually just this. When I read that table, I said, yes, I just want practical explanations. And I'm trying to get hold of Burks and Mills to see if I can collaborate with them actually to put a little bit of an online course together, because I just see such an absolute demand for people to have this broken down and made simple for them. So Lynlee, thank you very much. I think that's gone a long way, and people are very grateful for the fantastic explanation there that you've given us. Kopana's got an interesting question there. And talking about using grounded theory for an honors level. Now, when I've gone and spoken at I've spoken at Wits and Gibbs and other places, and I mentioned that I had a PhD in grounded theory, and a lot of people say, well, it's really more for the more PhD level, masters, etc. What about a modular research assignment? Is grounded theory suitable for something at an honors level?
I think you, at an honors level, considering the relatively short amount of time you have to actually finish that project, I think you have to be then really strategic about who it is that you're collecting your data from, how easy is it to access that sample, and how readily are they going to want to participate. When you're doing a grounded theory, you collect one interview, transcribe it, analyze it, and from that analysis, more questions emerge. You go back to that same participant with some follow-up questions. You get them to also clarify and confirm that you're on the right track in terms of your interpretation of the data. And so you do a follow-up interview, analyze that data, make up another follow-up interview, and then start contacting more participants. you can see how that's a lengthy data collection process. And so if you only have 8 months and you are going to spend 3 months struggling to get participants, you can see how that might be quite problematic. However, if you're really strategic and you already have relationships in the research environment where your participants trust you, you're an in-group member, they are eager to participate, and you know you're going to get participants really quickly, and you know that you can analyze the data pretty quickly in that sort of cyclical data analysis and collection process, why not give it a good go? But then you're going to have to be really restrictive in your sample size. I would say no more than 8 participants is probably a doable project at an honors level.
Brilliant. And I mean, just I think to give people some comparative numbers is very helpful, and that's extremely useful so they can get an idea of what sample size they'd be looking at. So my sample size was 25, so 25 interviews. And again, I absolutely agree with Lynlee. You know, big amount of time goes into actually, you know, nailing down those interviews and then going through that, never mind the arduous process of following the grounded theory methods and, you know, coding those interviews line by line and abstracting, you know, that data up through the different levels. I just want to touch on a question that has been come up in the chat. Where does the framework come through? So what I just quickly want to show you is my own thesis, and I'll put a link to this. But what I found so powerful in grounded theory was that it helps you create a theoretical framework. So this was actually my new theory that I developed, which was simply just a linear scale. But, you know, effectively what it meant was the grounded theory provided me the evidence of what was going on. And all I then had to do was to, you know, package that in a way that could be useful for people reading it. I had gone through the hard work of, you know, analyzing it using grounded theory. And to answer the question that came up in the chat, where does the theoretical framework come in, is that because of the inductive nature of grounded theory, you're actually able to develop your own theoretical framework. You may have, you know, looked at some in the literature, etc. And as Lynlee said at the beginning, you would have found gaps in ways that existing theoretical frameworks do or don't, you know, explain what is happening in the lives of participants. And I was studying the human factors of Agile software engineering, and I firmly believe that software engineering had almost forgotten about the human nature, the creative side of programmers. And you know, that theoretical framework that I'm showing there is a linear scale of 15 theoretical codes, and those 5 categories, of which there are 3 theoretical codes in each of them, is supported by the grounded theory work that I went through in the process. So I'll put a link to my thesis up in the chat just now as well. But your thoughts, Lynlee, on a theoretical framework and grounded theory and how that fits together?
Yeah, I think once you've locked in your own paradigm, your own ontology and epistemology, and if those words are scary to the students in attendance, try to not be afraid by that. Of that, essentially what we're saying there is, how do you see the world? How does it make sense to you? And you can just go and do a little bit of reading about that. And once you figure that out, you then find the grounded theory approach that is aligned with you. And then you have a look at the framework that's required. So, so Peter, did you end up doing a Straussian grounded theory?
Yes, I did the version where I'm more of a subjective researcher in the field, and I understand the fact that I have an imperfect data gathering process and that I'm likely to bring some bias into my research. Hence, I had to account for that bias, which I actually did in my thesis. So, you know, Strauss or Glaser, I can't quite remember, but it was the one where I don't believe I'm completely objective in the field. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, you are so Straussian. It's unbelievable.
Okay, Straussian, brilliant.
Yeah. If you are more Glaserian, you tending more towards a positivistic perspective, where you believe that you're more neutral, more objective, and you're just kind of reporting on the facts. That framework for the grounded theory is going to be very different from the framework used in a Straussian approach or in a Chalmers approach. And so my best advice to students is find the approach that just resonates with you, and you'll kind of know what that approach is, because when you start reading the different authors, some readings are just going to come more easily to you, and you're going to be more interested in reading about that particular author's approach. If you find yourself arguing with any of the sort of approaches, then that's probably not the approach for you. And I would say it's fair game at that point to go, maybe I'm not Glasserian, I'm going to abandon that and explore the others. But once you've made that kind of alignment, then follow that framework. Don't try and follow a generic grounded theory framework. It doesn't exist. You actually have to commit to a particular approach.
And Lynlee, would you say that my sort of slightly more simplistic explanation of being either a research that acknowledges my subjectivity or one that believes in purist objectivity in doing research is some guidance in terms of which track to approach if you are sort of trying to get that right in your own mind before going into a study?
Absolutely. Having a good think, and maybe this is why some researchers find grounded theory uncomfortable. Grounded theory holds a mirror up to you as the researcher and asks who you are. Some researchers go, that's a bit confronting. I don't feel like doing therapy today. I'm not going to do grounded theory. But as a researcher, if you're going, you know what, I know too much about this field and I care too much about the topic to pretend that I'm neutral, then Glasserian is not your approach. Maybe you've been working in the industry for a number of years, or you have done previous research on this area, and then you can't claim to not know anything about it. You can't claim to not have a favorite theory or a favorite approach, or to have even a social activist agenda where you go, I want to participate in this research because I have a clear agenda of helping this community in a particular way. Strauss then is the correct philosophical approach to align yourself with, where you just openly admit, as the researcher, this is my position, this is where I'm coming from, and this is what I'm bringing to the research. Then it means whoever reads your research goes, you know what, I maybe would have interpreted this differently, but now that I've read your unpacking of your position, now where you're coming from makes absolute sense. And so it just gives readers a space to appreciate where you as the researcher are coming from and how it is that you interpreted your work.
Yeah, and Lynlee, I'm going to ask you about yours because it was very interesting, and I read through your thesis, almost all 396 pages of it. It was incredibly comprehensive, and it's a masterclass in grounded theory application. But from my perspective, after 14 interviews, I was starting to develop theory, and you have to have this concurrent data collection and analysis going. And when I took the mirror and I held it up to myself, I realized that I was imprinting my assumptions on my analysis process. And I had to take a step back, and I did a detailed discussion paper at the stage of 14, and I realized that I had some biases around it, and I wasn't being sufficiently objective. So I had to start coming back to saying I need to produce a theory here, but I need to be open and honest about the degree to which I've influenced that theory. So I can put that theory out there, but the authenticity that grounded theory brings in is to demonstrate that bias. And it's also one of the reasons why they suggest not to go into too much literature review up front, because you also then start to simulate what the literature is telling you and already start to go in the direction of the popular authors or researchers that you're following. You must almost go in with a completely neutral or fresh perspective to develop the most objective theory. But Lynlee, I mean, medical male circumcision. I mean, so you had biases and you were passionate about this topic. And I actually used you in an example the other day. Somebody was asking on the Facebook group about, whether you actually have to do all your own research interviews. And I mentioned that in your thesis, you outsourced some of the interviewing process because I can't remember exactly whether there was a concern about the researcher and the interviewee and whether you'd get the right amount of authenticity and accuracy coming through in the data, etc. But medical male circumcision and your biases and your journey with grounded theory?
Yep, absolutely. So much to my very conservative family's shame, I'm known as the foreskin girl. Wow. I'm sure they're absolutely horrified. But I was, prior to starting my PhD and being a full-time academic, I was working at an NGO doing HIV education in hospitals and talking to nurses and having them sob openly about, they're not seeing a change in the HIV crisis. We need to have a serious prevention intervention. And at the time, male circumcision was coming up in its medicalized form as the potential solution. And the Department of Health in South Africa kind of did a number of feasibility studies and cost studies, and about 70% of males in South Africa said, yep, we will absolutely go for a circumcision. And so the government rolled out this intervention, and 5 years into the rollout, only 20% of males had taken it up. And so I was very interested in this disconnect. I didn't go into my project planning on doing a grounded theory because it was not something that was that I was particularly comfortable with. At an undergrad and at an honors and at a master's level, you kind of get told what grounded theory is, but you don't actually ever go and do one. And so I was like, I'm not going to choose my PhD to start trying out a new method. But the more I looked into the literature, there was no unifying theory that could actually explain how people understood such a novel intervention like male circumcision for HIV prevention. And so although I could spend literally hours talking about circumcision, I can kind of just give a highlights of my findings. Essentially, I relied heavily on field workers because I was collecting repeat semi-structured interview data from 30 adult males in Johannesburg. One participant let me interview them. The others went, this is not a space where a white girl speaking English who has no social capital in this space to be asking Black men about their foreskins, completely inappropriate. You need to know your lane. And so it makes absolute sense. It was culturally unsafe of me to think anything else. And so I relied heavily on field workers to collect the data, but you can imagine the anxiety. A PhD study where you're not collecting your own data, the control of what is happening to the data, what questions are being asked, how is it being asked, how is it being translated, how is it being transcribed. Anxiety levels were pretty high, but that is just part of the process. And so what I essentially found was that in talking to participants about their views on non-circumcision, traditional male circumcision, and then now this new medicalized version of circumcision for HIV prevention, put just a spotlight on the decolonizing approach that we need to have to public health messaging, because we now see this tension between the ways in which South African men perform their masculinity in relation to circumcision or non-circumcision, and if it is around circumcision, whether it's traditional or medicalized. And so these participants were kind of presenting contradictory positions around public health messaging and their understanding of male circumcision and whether it should be traditional or medical. And if the Department of Health continued to ignore those positions, they weren't going to have a successful intervention at all. And so my research just kind of highlighted the tensions that exist, and a grounded theory was a beautiful way of doing that, because it had created a new theory that explained the meanings that men attach to circumcision in the place of HIV prevention. And without that theory, we would just carry on thinking that men don't understand the intervention. They understand it perfectly. It doesn't fit with their cultural / modern views of who they are as men. And so it was frustrating, it was messy, it was confusing, but it was entirely worth it.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember that making meaning, coming through quite strongly in your thesis. And it's, as I said, guys, a masterclass just in the use of grounded theory, but then also the vehicle that I think Lynlee, and hearing her passion today about this topic, needed, to make the sort of ultimate, contribution into the field. And, whether or not it had the results or the change, I mean, as researchers, we have to do a good job of getting into the field, understanding it, presenting something back, and then it's going to find a home or a voice or a next step, and some of that is or isn't within our control. Lynlee, maybe then just back to a little bit of grounded theory, sort of, mechanics and so on. There was a question, and I'll find it just now, about saturation. So, and I mentioned the core category that sort of then starts to define or create a critical a center of gravity, if you like, around your theoretical framework. But then at an earlier stage, just talk us through this idea of saturation as an indicator of how much research on a specific topic or how much theoretical sampling or interviewing or data gathering you need to do.
Absolutely. I think one of the stumbling blocks that we come across when doing a grounded theory is sometimes we then start to actually mix or confuse our qualitative approaches. We'll end up doing a thematic analysis, or we'll end up doing a discursive analysis, and we'll end up breaching what a grounded theory actually is. And so it's really worthwhile to actually have a sticky note somewhere that just reminds you what grounded theory actually is, so that you stay true to it. As I said, it's a recursive, cyclical process of analyzing one participant's data, re-interviewing that participant, and in doing so, you kind of refine your interview schedule, because in analyzing that first data, you realize your interview schedule needs to have more questions added onto it. When you get to the point of you've analyzed maybe sort of 5 or 6 participants, you start realizing you don't have more questions that you need to add onto your interview schedule. Your participants are kind of rounding it off for you, of you hitting that point of you asking the right questions. So that's the first point, I think, at which you can start getting a sense of your data of, are you on the right track or not, just in terms of the questions you're asking your participants. When you are doing then in terms of data saturation and theoretical testing, my students laugh. I use the term a murder board. You guys know, in like detective shows or murder shows and movies and that type of thing, they'll have a board, and then they've got all the suspects, and they've got a piece of string and connecting all the pieces. That murder board is your best friend in terms of doing a grounded theory. When you're analyzing your data, you start making links between the different categories and the different properties and how things are kind of making sense. And you'll have your different post-it notes and your string. And every time you analyze a new interview schedule, you'll move stuff around. So it's a constant process of refinement. I think I wrote my analysis 8 times. I did it once and I thought I'm done and dusted. And then I went and looked at it and I went, something doesn't fit. Something doesn't make sense. I need to go and look at it again. And I redid it 8 times. 8 times of feeling I've got this, and then realizing you don't got this is very frustrating. But it's that refinement process of going, one day you step back and you go, everything clicks, everything makes sense, everything is accounted for as honestly as you possibly can, where you haven't ignored certain parts of the data, or you haven't escalated the data to higher concepts. One day you step back and you go, this is now perfect, now you're done. So it's difficult to say how many participants exactly that's going to get you to that point, but it happens organically as part of the process.
Yeah, Lynlee, I mean, just your point around the stickies, I mean, I absolutely, completely agree with that. And I walked into Vit's lecturer's office one day, and she was also busy with a grounded theory PhD in the engineering department. And literally, as I walked in, I was almost shocked, because on the wall next to her, she must have covered it with maybe 100 or more stickies. Yeah. And, you know, just this dynamic visualization of linking and creating relationships and changing your mind backwards and forwards. And then, you know, coming in the next day and realizing that's it, you know, or leaving and thinking, I'm never going to finish this, but knowing that there's something up on the board that you can engage with tomorrow, just like a murder investigation. So I absolutely would concur with the importance of that visualization. And it's something that comes through very strongly in the Burks and Mills book. Less so in some of the earlier writings, but I think that practical, and there's a lot of digital tools and mind mapping and so on that people can also use to help do that, and the tools like Invivo and Atlas TI, etc. But what I do always counsel to people is that, you know, don't rely on the tool. You're still the researcher, and just basic sticky notes up on your fridge or a wall or somewhere where you've got some space, etc. I just think creates that tactile experience. You can digitize it in preparation for putting it into your thesis, etc. But I wouldn't rely on Invivo or a tool or a mind map necessarily for your theory to jump out at you. I would suggest, you know, to everybody on the call today, you've got to have gone through what Lynlee went through and I went through, where you go down a cul-de-sac and it doesn't make sense. So what I did was, I mean, I had 2 or 3 frameworks that I developed, and I actually wrote a few blog articles about it. And I sent people a few articles and I put it up on my website, etc. And I was kind of excited about it, and I thought, okay, that's it, etc. And then I just wasn't getting, you know, people either been involved in my research or in the field or in the industry, etc. And, you know, on WhatsApp, you don't even get the blue ticks. They haven't even read your stuff. And I really got this kind of idea, this stuff's not landing. I've got to go back to the drawing board. and I had overcomplicated things, and I was trying to think of two axes, and eventually I just came up with that simple range, horizontal, linear framework, 15 theoretical codes, 5 categories of data, single core category. And when the light bulb came on, and I actually almost put it, I think, in one of my appendices when I was doing some self-reflection. From there on, it was just back up to the light almost, because I was in these deep, dark days of having done all this work and analyzing all these interviews. But when it made sense for me, I can honestly say that was almost the highlight of my PhD. And the rest was typing it up, packaging it, submitting it, and I knew it was in because I was so confident, that I had sort of really landed on this theory. And in my external examiner's report, they said this is a novel contribution to the industry, through the application of grounded theory. So I was it was such a satisfying feeling to have gone through that. So a couple of questions coming through. Then there's a question: what validates a grounded theory contribution? So that is what I was sort of talking about just now. But Lynlee, let's talk about theoretical sampling. So you can take your theory and almost go back to a couple of your interviewees and test it with them. So maybe let's just answer Dominic's question. How do we know, other than our own personal intuition and testing it with our supervisor, a couple of friends, etc., how do we know that we've reached that level of quality in terms of a new grounded theory?
Absolutely. It's such a good question. I think working closely, first of all, with your supervisor, they have some insights just in terms of the method, where they will give you hints whether something's clicking or not. But working closely with your participants is so important that there's something I think very honest and sincere about saying to your participants, this is my interpretation of what you've said. Am I on the right track? Am I really capturing what you've been saying? And so being honest and putting forward your summary and getting your participants to verify that is in fact what they're trying to say, is just an honest way of conducting your research. So your participants will tell you you're on the right track or not. If you have the opportunity at various stages of your research, try and present your work in various forums. So if you have a sort of a student symposia to present your work at, go ahead. Even if you aren't finished, you may go, I'm in the initial stages and this is where my head is at, and get audience feedback of, have you thought this? Have you thought that? Where, are you on the right track is really good feedback to get. It just kind of makes you go, I was looking at things this way. And the more people I talk to, that horizon just opens up and I start considering more and more things that I hadn't considered because I live in my brain.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. That's brilliant. And just on your point, Lynlee, I was fortunate enough to be able to present, my theory at an MBA cohort at Gibbs University here in Johannesburg. And I pretty much landed on the theory, but I was still in the process of writing up my thesis. It was my 6 months that, I teach in my course and how you go through that last 6 months to get your thesis completed. But it was just such a valuable opportunity. Over a couple of nights, I sort of went through my theory and tested it with the MBA students that were coming through and saying, guys, this makes sense. If you had to take this to your organization tomorrow, would there be value in applying this thinking? So I would really absolutely support Lynlee in testing out your thinking, whether it's with blog articles or doing presentations or, come into the Facebook group and, use communities like we've got here in the Student Success Coach to test these things out. We've got just a question around, and I think the sample size that you touched on is quite important because, Muriel's obviously looking to just benchmark, whether doing a grounded theory and the sample size, etc. I think what we've mentioned on the chat just now very importantly is, there is a lag time in getting, people committed to interviews. And I did a bit of a shotgun approach. I put it up on LinkedIn and Twitter, etc. And then I had maybe 30 people that said yes, but then actually nailing them down to an interview, getting your consent form signed, because Wits, you and I, where we studied, Lynlee, and other institutions will have an ethics policy that you need to get through. So there's a little bit of friction that you have to go through to get those interviews. So I really agree with Muriel, to have that number in your mind. However, my caution would be, and I learned this, and I don't know if Prof. Carmichael is listening in, but don't get obsessed with frequency or volumes or numbers. Even if you did one interview in theory or 100 interviews, you must have the theoretical sensitivity to understand what are the important concepts and elements of that data that you need to elevate. So counting the number of times a certain word props up or a phrase pops up in 20 different interviews, automatically giving you some sort of frequency calculation of your core category or the prime suspect that came up on the chat just now. Be very careful of frequency-based analysis. That's much more the quantitative type of analysis. But I certainly do agree. And Muriel, in my thesis, which I posted on the chat now, you'll see in one of my appendices, I benchmarked my study against a number of other grounded theory studies, including Lynlee's. And I said, okay, well, I've got 25. This one did 40. This one did 10. This one did 30. What is similar, what are different, etc. So we've mentioned 8 or so for an honors. We're saying maybe 16 for a master's. I did 25 for a PhD. I think you did 30 for a PhD. I've seen a PhD with 50, 60 interviews, but there were 2 researchers, for example. So Lynlee, just your thoughts on the sort of quantities as a way of benchmarking the amount of work that you have to do and the size of your study for a master's level like Muriel.
Yeah. So also bear in mind, you're going to have repeat interviews with your participants. So you may say, I'm going to interview 12 people, but then you'll end up interviewing each person twice, 3 times. See how big that data set lands up getting. So it's really difficult to pin down the amount of hours you're actually going to have by way of interview data. I would say rule of thumb, though, 12 for a master's level seems about right, but depends on also your topic. If you have a really niche area and you're looking at how people make sense of a particular phenomenon, and you know that the experience of that phenomenon is really rare, I'm going to get 12 participants, but you know that only 3 people in the whole world have experienced that phenomenon. It may be worth going, I'm going to work with those 3, but I'm going to interview them each, 5 times. So work with the participants. Some participants are going to be so eager to engage with your topic, every time you ask them for a follow-up interview, they will go yes. So rather than thinking about the number of participants, think about the number of hours of data you're going to have, including the repeat interviews.
Very helpful, Lynlee. Thank you so much. And then, we touched on ethics just now. And Stanley, I'm not too sure what university you're at. I think there'd be fairly sort of, some standardization in that. But I think what your question is asking is whether you have to supply an exact list of the people that you're going to interview through your ethics application. And I don't recall that I had to do that. I needed to supply an information sheet that I would send them. I needed to commit to keeping the respondents' data private and destroy it after 5 years, for example, and also that I would get the consent form and keep that available if the university needed to ask me for it. So, Lynlee, I don't think you would have to have a list of your actual interviewees as part of your ethics application process.
That's exactly right. You, ethically speaking, cannot start recruiting participants until you have your ethical clearance. And so any ethics committee that goes, we want the details of your participants, I would kind of just question whether I understand the process properly. What an ethics committee wants to know is what type of participants are you going to have? What are your inclusion and exclusion criteria? And they just want to know that you're going to conduct a methodologically sound study that is safe for your participants, as opposed to who exactly are those participants. Once you've got your ethical clearance number, you can go ahead with the heavy duty task of actually recruiting participants.
Okay. And guys, thank you very much for the comments. So Puti, afternoon, everyone. Great. This is going to be very helpful to some of us. And I think, Lynlee, although we pitched it as grounded theory, it's generally qualitative research. I think is, we've sort of touched on a lot of those topics that have come through there. Cara, who's a regular on the webinar, and she's actually going to be coming up in one of our podcast interviews fairly soon, is asking about whether it can be used exclusively in certain fields or applicable in all fields. So, Cara, let me give my perspective. And I think, as we've heard from Lynlee, it was developed in the social sciences. But, for example, in software engineering, which is much more reliant on the scientific or the quantitative methods, being computer programming, I felt I needed to borrow from another field and use grounded theory to understand the social sciences aspects of software engineering. So this sort of crossover between fields, I think is becoming quite popular and is actually where the new and novel insights are coming from. If you look at, all the breakthroughs, it's coming from the overlaps or the touch points between different fields. So Lynlee, your thoughts? I mean, I would certainly suggest Cara, and I certainly, people didn't frown at me or give me any resistance, etc. But certainly during the period of my PhD, my supervisors were coming to me and saying, actually, Pete, I mean, we went to a software engineering seminar the other day, and there was a guy there talking about using grounded theory, and you're doing this grounded theory thing. So, I mean, one of my supervisors wasn't a grounded theory expert, but, clearly he also went through a journey and learned about the value and the importance of using grounded theory in software engineering.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Grounded theory really is one of those approaches where if you're dealing with human beings as participants, it's a great theory. And I think it's a real way to pull in a multidisciplinary approach. Our research teams, if you only are dealing with psychologists, they're wearing their psychology hats. But if you open up that team to include people from, psychology, health, public health, sociology, anthropology, the wider your circle, the bigger your thought process is for your ability to explain what is happening. So I think it's so great that we can look at any type of field. It doesn't just have to be sort of social sciences in the traditional sense.
I totally agree. And I mean, I think, if you go back and look at Strauss and Glazer's original theory of dying, they were studying people in the sort of mortality units of hospitals, for example, and now it's sort of spread into so many different fields. So, Cara, to answer your question, I think absolutely it can be used. And guys, join into grounded theory communities, and like we've done today, there's passionate people who have produced really wonderful contributions to industry using grounded theory. Also, just to touch on your question here about it's difficult to get people to interview, and I think that's a common thing that people find challenging, and you often find that the logistics and the practicalities of getting interviews is your critical path, and if you don't get going with that, it can be the single biggest thing that delays certainly your data gathering process. And then you have to limit your analysis and you have to limit your write-up, and all of those get compromised. So when I hop on a coaching call with somebody and I offer that for 30 minutes for free just to help people, and I had somebody the other day who was in exactly the same position, and I said, make a list of 10 people today and email all of them. And WhatsApp them as well if you have to, and without being too blunt with them, see if you can get them to commit to an interview within the next week. And let's say you need to get, as we've heard now, 12 interviews done for your masters. Aim and plan to do 20, because a few of them are going to drop off. A few of them are going to say, look, I don't have time. I found I was interviewing people at, strategic IT firms, for example, and they said, look, no, we're not, we don't talk about this, etc. We can't, even though it was going to be anonymized and all the rest of it. So people will drop off. And also, I think that's what you're talking about. You need to have a few backup plans. You need to have people that, if you need 5, go for 10. Lynlee, some of your thoughts about the practicalities. I mean, you had to go through the extra, admin of having somebody else do your interview. So you were lining up 2 people, never mind just somebody to interview.
Yeah, absolutely right. I'm not sure how familiar students are with snowballing techniques. That is your best friend in terms of trying to get your participants. And so essentially what snowballing is you find one person who's keen, and you interview them and you go, hey, do you know anyone else, maybe your friends or family or someone in your community who would be interested? And they go, yeah, my neighbor would love to talk about this. And you go, excellent, may I have their contact details? Now you've got an in on the community. And so literally you rely on each participant to kind of give a referral to someone who they think would be interested. Having that participant's kind of buy-in gives credibility to you as the researcher. They'll go, oh, you know what, Lynlee is so interesting, she's so lovely, she's so trustworthy, you should go and kind of participate. So you kind of have some street cred is the way to say it with your participants if they are being referred by a friend or family member or just someone who they know. That's the way that I did all of my research, is through snowballing. And I think particularly things like COVID-19, everyone is fatigued, right? People have kind of reached a threshold of, I do as best as I can and I have nothing more to offer. Doing face-to-face interviews via Zoom is now a new complex thing that we have to think about in our research. So let's bear in mind our current context. Maybe you're not going to get 30, maybe 15, and that is good enough to produce some good research. I think let's be practical and let's not punish ourselves because we can't get these massive data sets. That's not what qualitative research wants anyway. We are idiographic. We want to give in-depth analysis of certain participants rather than having a numbers game.
And even in the numbers game, I was coaching a student the other day who was doing a PhD, and she was trying to get 400-500 surveys done. Now, you might think the quantitative sort of approach gives you that, process, and you just run the process. But even getting people to submit a survey online is tough these days. So just Jen's question there, is it absolutely necessary to interview participants more than once? I don't think so. It's good to go back and double check, look at the hours that you need to spend, etc. But Lynlee, your thoughts on that?
I would say if you have a concern around interviewing a participant more than once, maybe have another method as a backup plan. Grounded theory, particularly a Straussian approach, which is the approach that I just align myself with. Part of the method is relying heavily on the participants to verify your initial analysis. And so if you have no ability to actually get their input on that, it kind of puts a floating question mark over the verification process of your data. And so I would advise, if you have any anxieties around that, then maybe put off a grounded theory for a different project, because there will be other projects, and then choose something that you think is more feasible for your immediate project.
Okay, and then I just want to go back to Nate was asking, so actually once you've had an interview, but they may be very hostile and difficult in the interview, I guess the question is, do you go back and try again, or do you declare them as hostile and keep them out of the data set? I don't know. Your thoughts on that? I mean, you must have had some pretty tricky interviews to manage.
Indeed. Some participants talking about male circumcision when that's genital mutilation, and you go, oh, this conversation has gone a very different track. I think being in a psychology background puts maybe my headspace around dealing with participants a little bit differently. We certainly never push our participants for further interviews if they do not want to be interviewed again. I think reading the room and having that finesse of going, this participant just doesn't want to engage any further. Make a note of that in your reflexivity of going, this was the data I had. This is how I've interpreted it within the scope. This was my impression. And they didn't avail themselves to verify this or to give anything further, but they have provided an interview. And so out of respect for that participant, you work with what they gave you. Try and limit the judgment on that person, because you don't know. And without them being able to verify whether they were hostile or anxious, right? Those are two different things entirely. And without them being able to verify their position, it can be really tricky. So in grounded theory, in general, try and reserve all judgments until you have a better sense of what's happening with the data. But it's tricky, right? As a researcher, you get so into it and you get that momentum and you just want to do something with it. And yet grounded theory is going, whoa, just slow down, take it easy. So it's against our inquisitive nature almost.
Yeah, and then again, the caution of just how much time you've actually got in an honors or even master's level, because that's going to start stressing you if that clock is starting to tick loudly. And just to Christine's point, all 25 of my interviews were over Zoom or Skype at the time. We didn't have Teams. It wasn't as prevalent back then, because I wanted to do an international study, but I just didn't have the funding to travel, around the world literally. And in my thesis, if you want to go read there, I did a little bit of a self-assessment of just some of the thoughts around, interviewing over Zoom or digital. So you can't read all the body language, for example. You get a little bit fatigued because there's a degree of concentration on only one or two senses through which you're trying to extract all your, insights, etc. But again, that is something that you just state as a limitation in your thesis, and you say, look, I didn't have access to body language. If I was interviewing Lynlee now, for example, I don't know if there's distractions in the room. I don't know if she's fully concentrating, for example. I know that she is because she's such an excellent person to interview. But you just write that up as a limitation. Again, nobody expects you to run a perfect study, but you are expected to be rigorous in your academic method as you go through it. So have a look in mine, because I know you were face to face. I was all on Zoom, etc., which was quite interesting. Dependent on the community that you're interviewing, some are not familiar or comfortable with online communication. 100%. I think there are all those aspects that you have to be, quite aware of. Then Cara asks about grounded theory in cancer research. I certainly have come across grounded theory in cancer research. So it seems to me like Cara maybe is interested in grounded theory. And Lynlee, I don't want to offer on your behalf, but I'm always certainly available just for a 30-minute call if anybody does want to have a quick catch-up with me, because often you can't get into the specifics of people's research, in these types of sessions. But Cara, I'm certainly happy to hop on a call for 30 minutes, and Lynlee, I think, might be in the group, and you can certainly ask her some more specific questions around cancer research. But Lynlee, your thoughts in the medical fraternity, the use of grounded theory in general?
It's so prevalent in nursing. It's one of the fields where grounded theory really has its moment to shine in trying to make sense of people's experience and how they make meaning of their illness, of their recovery, of their treatments, because all of that plays such a big role in whether the participant is willing to engage with the medical intervention or not. If they don't believe in it, they're not going to kind of show up for appointments. They're not going to adhere to the treatment regime being prescribed. And so grounded theory goes, we have to really understand the human experience and how they make meaning of this, because if participants don't make meaning of this in a particular way, they just don't have buy-in to it. So it's major in particularly in nursing.
Okay, so that's great. And certainly from a software engineering perspective, I've seen that it's starting to become quite popular, especially when we're looking at the human factors aspects of research. Lynlee, I mean, we're sort of in the last sort of few minutes of our time together, and I really want to just say, humble appreciation for your contribution and support to me personally in my grounded theory journey. I sort of kept you updated as I went through the process, and it was just great to have had you there at the original workshop, and then to kind of close the loop back now 6 years later as just a ground theory convert. So I'm sure, I don't know how many of the other people in that workshop can say the same thing.
Peter, it's such a pleasure, and it's wonderful that continents apart now, meeting up with you and other students from around the world, the thing that's uniting us is grounded theory. I'm so enthused. It's wonderful that we have this opportunity. So thank you for inviting me and for including me in this process. It's wonderful.
No, that's an absolute pleasure. And just, in the chat, guys, I just have put a couple of useful links there. And the one big shout out is to Burks and Mill's book on practical grounded theory. Now, having said that, you shouldn't ever be over-reliant on one author or one source, etc. So just make sure that you read widely. And also people that are evaluating or examining a grounded theory thesis or final report, you are absolutely going to have some working knowledge, Glaser, Strauss, Sharmaz, and there's a few others that specialize in different. Johnny Saldana, for example, I brought him in, when I was doing my coding, and there were some specifics around that was quite useful, etc. I've also put a couple of links, in the chat, guys, so that if you're not in the Facebook group, please join us. It's members only. It's moderated. It's a safe environment for us to, share the challenges and get the support that we need from each other. Postgraduate study or even undergraduate study can be lonely, even before lockdowns and COVID. So, we need the support and the insights, from our fellow students. I've also put the website there. We interviewed this week on the show the president of the Convocation of Wits University, Stacey Lee Bolon. She represents 200,000 staff, alumni, and students. So we spoke about, some of the issues that she's grappling with, as she strives to make the alumni community in Wits, relevant for students that are still trying to make their way through their studies and, get the support and so on that you need. And there's a weekly interview there of successful students, the idea being to just get inspired by people who've walked a journey, so that you can also, reach, those same heights. As I said there on the chat, just be inspired by those weekly stories of student success. on the podcast. So Lynlee, last thoughts, from your side. What time is it there with you? Is it bedtime or dinner time?
It is now 10 o'clock at night, and I'm going to have me some sleepy time tea and take myself off to bed with a good book.
Okay, Lynlee, well, hey.
No, I was just going to say thank you so much for the time, and I know the time difference, but I see a couple of students on the chat are actually some of my students that I'm currently supervising in Australia. So what literally cross continents that everyone just is interested in grounded theory. I think that's wonderful. Thank you for facilitating this.
No, absolute pleasure. And I did forget to mention that a very warm welcome to Lynlee's, students and community from Australia. And Lynlee will continue to follow your success, with great admiration. And as I've said before, there's lots of resources for you on the YouTube channel, the Facebook group, and even Lynlee herself. You can get in touch with her. So please do make use of all those resources. It's our commitment to your success. So Lynlee, thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it. Enjoy, have a good rest, a good evening, and I'm sure that we'll chat soon. And again, a big thank you. I think there's been lots of value for everybody on the session today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, Lynlee.
You're welcome. Thanks.